Chapter 18. The Attack. It was still early in the afternoon. Joe Two Trees called to Kane, and the two set out along the banks. Joe felt safer near the river. Here the city was not so close upon them. Woods and grassy meadows still existed. True, he passed people very frequently now, but he had begun to be used to the stairs again. He just kept going along the city's fringe in spite of them. The dog, however, was another matter. She didn't like people at best, with the exception of her master. Each time a man or woman came into sight, she growled or snarled, begging to be ordered after them. Joe was quick to see the potential danger in this. Eventually, she was almost sure to misinterpret some harmless move by one of the whites as a threat against Joe. She would then be duty-bound to attack and kill. Joe had had enough of killing in this city. He wanted to avoid trouble at any cost. He sat down and, using his knife, cut long strips of deerskin from the excess material along the seams of his trousers. He tied these into a looped leash for Kane. She had never felt the cut of rope around her neck, and first she shied away from the loop. But when she understood that it was a thing her master wanted of her, she accepted. The shoreline was changing here. Roads led to it and ended at wooden piers. In some spots, boats were tied up. One dock looked more familiar than the rest. Joe gazed back along the road that led up to it, and he was reasonably sure it was the one he had run down on a long-ago night. The area had changed. He noticed that there now seemed to be fewer buildings of wood. Those that remained had a ramshackle look. New, taller buildings of brick and stone had begun to predominate. One thing was still the same, though. Everyone rushed from place to place, appearing very concerned over something. They hardly even seemed to notice him. This pleased Two Trees. Here and there, though, someone would stare at the dog. Joe smiled inwardly at the looks of fear she evoked. It was good that they realized she was a force to be considered. When last he walked these same streets, he had no such protection. It was only a few blocks now. Joe wondered what Tony's reaction would be. He hoped the shopkeeper wouldn't be angry or disappointed that Two Trees hadn't sought out his uncle in Staten Island. But as he thought about it, Joe was sure the man wouldn't mind. He had sent Joe there to save him, and fate had accomplished that end. So Tony's purpose had been realized. No, Tony would be glad to see Joe. They would sit and tell each other stories of the many years. Tony would have coffee for them to drink. As he visualized the happy reunion, Joe became fully convinced that he had done the right thing in coming here. Then he remembered the silver coins he had left with Tony. He could use these to buy supplies for the coming winter. A new pair of boots especially would be welcome. He wouldn't ask Tony for the money, though. If he had forgotten it or chose to keep it, as Joe once offered, Two Trees would understand. He owed the man for his help to a young Indian boy. He turned a corner, and across the street was the old alley that had once been his home. It was too much to disregard. Joe found that he couldn't pass without taking time to stop and reminisce. By the force of old habit, he looked to make sure no one was watching, and then walked into the gloomy shadows. As he reached the end, Joe marveled. It seemed as though no one had walked here since the day he had left. The trees still stood, blocking the spot from the rear. Leaves were still blown by some quirk of the wind into the very corner where he once slept away cold winter nights. He noticed the spot where his enemy's body had fallen. The rains of many seasons had long since washed away the blood stains. The Indian thought grimly about that, and decided it had probably taken the rain a long time to finish this particular work. He reached into his shirt and drew out the flint knife. Its blade still glittered in the faltering light with some strange life all its own. Joe turned and tucked the knife away. It was growing dark, and he wanted to get to Tony's before the store was closed for the night. As he started back out of the alley, something stopped him. He turned and looked again. Someone had been here since that day. When he had left, Joe had been in a hurry. He had scooped his silver out of the hole near the trees and left his rock cover lying to one side. He had not taken the time to reseal the hole, because that would serve no purpose except to delay him. Now the stone sat neatly, flush with the ground around it. Someone had closed the hole, and quite carefully at that. He walked back to the rock and stood in the shadows of the old trees. Joe stooped and pulled at the rock. He was correct in thinking the cover had been well reset. He gave it one strong tug, and it popped loose. There, amid the water-ravaged remains of a paper bag, Joe saw the distinctive sheen of silver. He reached in and extracted the dollars. It looked to be about the same number that Tony had promised to save for him. This was amazing. What strange thing had happened here during the years of his travels? The only people who had ever known about this hiding hole were Tony and the two surviving thieves. Tony had once asked if Joe kept his pay money in a safe place, and Joe had told him about his little spot. The thieves, of course, had seen it for themselves. It was certain that they would not come here to put money into Joe's cash. This must mean that the money had been buried by Tony. But this made no sense. Why would he do so when the silver would certainly be safer in his own store a few blocks away? This was all too confusing. Joe trotted away toward the store, the coins making a heavy jingling noise as he went. He rounded the last corner and stopped abruptly. Tony's store looked different. It was larger, and its front had changed. Then Joe saw why. It had grown to include the small shop that had formerly stood next to it, attached but separated by a wall. Now the two were one single large store. Something was wrong here. Two Trees sensed immediately that something different than Tony's store was behind those shiny new windows. Then the door opened, and two men staggered to the street unsteadily. Through the briefly opened door, Joe heard music and laughter. It was a bar room. Had Quiet Tony, the shopkeeper, opened a bar? It didn't make sense. Joe crossed the street to the door, but hesitated out front. He wanted to go inside and ask for his old friend, but he was afraid. The noise, the idea of being enclosed with all those white men, these weighed heavily upon him. There was Kane, though. They would keep their distance from her. Then, too, how else could he hope to find Tony? The dog tried to pull him away, past this place of bad sense. There was sweat, whiskey, dirt, men, beer, and a host of smells that made her broad-muscled shoulders bristle. She must have been upset that he held her here. She wanted him to leave with her and whined her plea, but Joe hushed her. He mustered up all the confidence he owned and pushed through the door. Joe walked inside and stopped to look around the room. As he did, so did everything else stop. The piano ceased its tinkle. Glasses were held poised in front of mouths. Conversations halted in mid-word. While this silence endured, every eye in the house watched the woodsman and his dog. Joe knew he presented an unusual sight for these city dwellers, but he hadn't expected this reaction. His hair had grown long during the summer on the river. It hung dark and straight to his shoulders. His clothing consisted of buckskin and fur. His feet were covered by hand-crafted moccasins. The belt around his middle was made from the skin of a very large snake. Also, there was a growling black giant at his side. Joe reconsidered. Perhaps the reaction of these city men was not so strange after all. He forced his weathered features into a smile. This seemed to be the signal for all to return to their previous activities. The music and drinking resumed, and Joe relaxed a bit. He was aware of the frequent glances that still came his way, however. Joe went to an open place along the bar and waited for the bartender to come to him. He planned only to ask for the whereabouts of Tony. The bartender cut him short by telling him he would have to tie the dog outside. Joe tried to protest this, but the man seemed quite adamant. He would neither serve nor speak to Joe until this was done. Recognizing it as unavoidable, the Indian complied. Kane protested as Joe tied her lead to one of the iron rings on the stone hitching posts, but he calmed her down. She agreed to stay, but her yellow eyes told him it was done against her better judgment. Joe went in again, and the man's smile told him he had been wise to do as he was told. The sound of silver in Joe's pouch may also have been responsible for the smile. The man asked what Joe would have to drink. Joe responded that he didn't like whiskey. The bartender walked off and returned a few seconds later with a frothy mug of beer. Joe hadn't actually ordered it, but realized that refusal would not be a good way to start out if he hoped to obtain any information. He reached into his pouch and gave $1. Soon it was replaced by a pile of smaller coins. Joe remembered the time Tony had explained the idea of change. Perhaps this man was an honest one too. Did his eyes linger a bit too long on Joe's pouch, though? Joe was intrigued by the golden liquid. He watched the way bubbles rose from no particular source in the glass and joined the white foam at top. He noticed many similar drinks along the bar. If all these men drank it, it couldn't be something to fear. He decided to try it. He raised the mug to his lips and sipped. It was nothing like the fiery liquid that had once caused him to cough and be ridiculed. This was different, cool, almost pleasant. He took another, larger gulp. It was pleasing to the tongue. It grew tastier with each further draught. Somehow, several more mugs found their way to Joe's hand before he remembered his original purpose. He had started to feel a very pleasant warmth. He would ask about Tony as soon as the bartender stopped running back and forth bringing beer. He knew he would get around to it, but the beer tasted so good. What difference would one more make? The time came when Joe knew that if he didn't ask now, he would forget. He called out loudly, and the man came over. Joe was finding it odd that he had trouble saying words. This hadn't happened to him in a very long time. He spoke English as well as he spoke Algonquin. Then he suddenly remembered the naming of Connie. He didn't speak Algonquin any longer. The thought had a sobering effect. "Where is Tony?" asked the Indian. The question was answered by the blank smile every bartender reserves for meaningless prattle from inebriated patrons. Joe asked again, and slowly, ever so slowly, He made the man understand that he actually wanted some reply beyond the inane smile. The man told Joe he had never heard of any person called Tony who had his shop here. When he came here from Ireland, relatives had taken him to see the 2 vacant buildings. With some help from them, he bought and made one large place from the former 2. He gestured around with his arms and said, "As you can well see, my wild friend." Joe felt some slight insult in the words, but the man's smile and the beer's effect put that out of mind. Even drunk, his brain deduced what was probably the simple truth of the situation. Tony had tired of shopkeeping, for one of many possible reasons. He had left for another place then. It could have been the uncle's farm or Italy or any other place. Joe knew then that he would never see the Italian again. The man was gone, lost to him forever, somewhere along the many years and miles of life. But when he was ready to leave, Tony had thought of Joe. If the boy ever did come back, he would need money. Tony had probably taken the silver very secretly to the alley and left it. Joe smiled. Tony had been a fiercely honest man. That he already knew. The silver offered further proof. Joe silently hoped that Tony had found a better place for himself. It would not be hard, thought the Indian part of him, to find a better place than this city. He thanked the bartender politely and turned toward the door. Even before he reached the street, Joe knew something was wrong. He could hear Kane crying wildly. When he pushed out to the street, the sight unnerved even Joe. Her ears were flat against her skull. The hair along her entire back bristled straight and stiff as a porcupine's, and she stood upright, almost strangled by the leash. Joe ran toward Kane to release the rope, but he never reached the hysterical animal. Something hard hit him on the side of the head. He wasn't unconscious, but he couldn't keep to his feet. As Two Trees fell, he recognized the sticky warmth of blood running down his scalp and neck. He hit the hard cobblestone street and tried to rise. He couldn't. Another blow from the same heavy instrument fell. Time passed. Seconds, minutes, hours may have passed. Gradually, by slow degrees, Joe became aware that he was still alive. His first impression was one of wetness and a roaring noise in his ears. He thought he was lying face down in the river, drowning. Then he pulled his head up and realized that the wet was his own blood. A large puddle had accumulated under his face and made mud with the dirt of the street. Joe had almost died, drowned in it. Then he turned his face to locate the source of the unfamiliar roar. A large circle of men stood around him. They yelled and screamed, but mixed with their sounds was the howl of Kane. She stood over the helpless Indian, ready to kill or die before anyone would be able to touch her fallen master, and none was so foolish as to try. Joe struggled to get up and realized he was badly hurt. He wasn't yet sure if any bones were broken, but several teeth were splintered, and many deep cuts covered his body. He could feel that innumerable boots had left their mark on his sides, back, and head. He fell back to the street and was sick. The muscular spasms of vomiting left him weaker and in more pain than before. Slowly, the crowd evaporated into the night. First by ones, then by twos and threes. He was left alone. The fun was over. The spectacle was finished. They went home to their pipes and porridge, wives and wine. There was nothing to watch except the last few drops of blood draining from the body of an obscure stranger. It was late. The dog stayed by the bleeding man, ready to die of hunger by his side if he didn't rise before that happened. Through the night she stood her watch, knowing no other thought than the man. She licked his face clean and nuzzled him with her cool, wet nose. By dawn, even Kane was sure he would die. She started to cry, as only an animal can. She grieved, deep in her body, for the lost master. Her cries traveled a long, soft route through her flesh, and by the time they reached her throat, they were only tiny sounds. Those were the sounds Joe Two Trees finally heard as he woke. Joe rolled over feebly. His hand went to a long gash around his throat. Blood was still pumping from the deep cut, but he didn't notice that. His hand found the thong around his neck and followed it from end to end. The tooth of Kona was gone. He rose to his knees and searched, hand over hand, from one cobble to the next. It was gone. They had taken his totem thing. He also noticed that the pouch of silver was missing. That seemed not so important. The tooth of the cave bear was his manhood, strength. They had taken it. Joe fell back to the street, unconscious. When he woke again, it was already full light. They had not done the thing they had set out to do. He would not let them do it now. His fingers found the haft of his knife. They had missed it. Holding its reassuring handle, he drifted between life and death. Joe came more alert with the coming day. He pulled himself to his knees, using the dog for balance. She tried to help in every way possible, but it amounted only to whimpering and supporting his weight. In time, he was able to rise to a shaky, standing position. Crouching, with a hand still resting on the dog's shoulder, he took a few steps. It surprised him to find that he was able to do this. Every breath drawn into his lungs was painful. No doubt he had sustained several broken ribs. One leg hurt badly. It was probably broken also, but by resting his weight on the dog, he could still use it somewhat to support him. His left hand was useless. Some boot had crushed its bones during the attack. Most of the cuts had crusted closed. Only the really deep ones still oozed blood. Two Trees took mental stock of his condition, and some inner yardstick of survival told him he had not reached the mark that spelled out death. Joe was satisfied. Neither happy nor sad, simply satisfied. For one who had survived till now on the strength of wits alone, survival was not a happening to be celebrated. It should be accepted. That is how Joe reacted to it. Kane supported him as he limped to the river. There he splashed water in his face. He didn't wash out his many wounds. That would only open them and cause more loss of blood, a thing he couldn't spare right now. The river gave him hope. Joe remembered the hidden place in the canoe. That was where he would try to go. Man and dog turned upstream to retrace their earlier steps. If they had gotten strange glances a day earlier, the looks were now openly hostile. He ignored them. Once, several young boys threw stones at Joe and Kane. He couldn't contain the deep anger any longer. Joe loosened the leash and sent the dog after them. In a few minutes, she returned with rich red color around her mouth. He felt not the smallest twinge of guilt or sorrow. He was almost ashamed of what he felt. Joe was about to put the leash back on Connie's neck, but something kept him from it. She was a fierce, brave one, a lover of freedom. The leash was wrong. He prepared to throw it in the flowing river, but stopped. Something about its end caught his eye. It had been cut. He stopped and examined it carefully. There was no doubt. It was cut off clean, as only a knife could do. Until now, He had naturally assumed that Kane had chewed it through. He looked at the end for a third time. It was cut. That meant that someone in the crowd had turned Kane loose. Why? Joe wondered about it as they made their way upriver. Someone had released his dog so that she could save him. It would have taken very few more kicks to kill. He knew no one there. Why would a white do such a thing for an Indian? He owed his life to some anonymous white back there. Joe was to wonder over these puzzles for a great number of years and never find an answer. Armed with that knowledge, Joe tried to keep from hating every American he saw. It didn't work. The information passed through his mind and faded from importance. It had happened. He was alive. There was no further value to it. To stay alive was now the imperative that governed his body and mind. That would, at best, not be easy. He tripped and stumbled many times, blinded by blood that found courses from the many scalp wounds into his eyes. Often, the dog licked him back to consciousness. If not for her, he would have stopped, to bleed to death along the way, or be arrested and bleed to death in jail. The movement of walking was deeply painful, but the hurt that occurred when he fell was much worse. It was the goad that kept Two Trees on his feet. Gradually, he made progress to the north. As the houses grew farther apart, Joe started to feel a strength of wild places pervade his injured body. He walked through the night, afraid to stop. He knew that rest would only serve to stiffen him, like the wounded deer. If he lay down to sleep, he knew he would be unable to rise with the light of day. He must be in a safe place before he catered to the wounds that covered him. If he did not reach the protected beach where the canoe was hidden before resting, he would not reach it at all. This was not the place or way that fate or his teaching Manitou had chosen for the death of the last Bronx Algonquin, however. The primal strength of his Indian spirit forced Two Trees on, and past the known limits of his endurance, on again. At some point along his way, the pain itself, as extreme injuries sometimes do, became its own anesthetic. By the very intensity of its strength, it numbed itself and allowed him to go forward. The man and dog inched along, periodically wading into the river to draw strength from its chilly water. Joe knew that the spirits of Manitou, the evil entity, walked at night. It was important to keep going. When light came, most of these spirits would go back to their cave and be replaced by those of light. Joe preferred that his fate should ultimately be in the hands of those more friendly spirits. A cold wind brought drizzle with the dawn. Joe hardly noticed. He was thinking about the future. Even as they walked uptown along the river, Joe Two Trees decided that there would, in fact, be a future. His body yearned for rest, but something else drove him on. He needed a goal in order to keep going, and his mind was starting to provide it. The day was no longer young when Kane and Joe stumbled to the security of the hidden cove. Joe struggled down the steep embankment, more falling than not, and arrived at the place where he had left his things only a day ago. He scrambled into the hidden place and gathered forth the skin of his great bear. Wrapping himself in this medicine thing, he slept within seconds. Kane placed her body against him and gave what little she had, her warmth. Joe knew nothing of it. Only time would now tell if he would ever wake again. Day came, dull and wet. Joe did not stir. The dog seemed nervous, but she stood and waited. Instinct told her sleep would do more to heal her master than anything she could do. Later in the morning, he woke. The muscles had stiffened, broken bones swollen, but life was still there. When Kane saw that he was awake, she licked his face until he sat. Joe tried to move various parts of his body. He counted many bones that he knew were broken. Then he felt with his good hand at the deep cuts over his body. He became aware that many of these were knife cuts. Several still oozed blood more than one full day later. He objectively judged his chances of survival. They were poor. Here, in front of a crackling fire, it was easy for me, a young boy, to ask questions about survival. I asked if he wasn't afraid. Joe answered simply, "Yes." As ancient as he was, a straightness had come to his back and shoulders. The talk of fighting for life had awakened things in the old man. He tried to explain them. He had done his best. He had worked toward life. After this, there was only one thing left, the will of his God. When Joe managed to reach the cove and find his bearskin, he had done all that the Maker could ask. Now came that spirit's turn. Joe pointed out that each man must eventually come to a point where, having done his utmost, he awaits the verdict of the Almighty. That was the point Joe had reached. The outcome of his sleep depended on something, but it wasn't his strength, the weather, or any other fact humans count as important. The issue had entered other realms.